Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Valerie Gugino, covering public safety. Next to me is Ed Dolan, specific detailed subject matter questions. I will be happy to answer them. Thank you for joining this open data week session titled Exploring Perspective on Emergency Response Times. During this presentation, I will dive into how I've used open data to analyze fiscal years 2014 to 2024 citywide ambulance response time and IBO's most recent report. Today, I will take you through the process, methodology, and the findings behind this report. If you have any specific questions on that report or methods, there will be time for questions at the end of the presentation. Please also feel free to reach out to me or Ed after the presentation. Our contact information can be found on the last slide. To start, I'm going to give a brief overview of the New York City Independent Budget Office. The New York City Independent Budget Office, IBO, is a nonpartisan city agency that provides independent fiscal and policy analysis to the public, the city council, and other stakeholders. Under the New York City Charter is to enhance public understanding of the city's budget, fiscal policies, tax revenue, and the local economy. IBO examines the city's budget, taxes, and other major policy issues, including topics such as emergency response, to provide New Yorkers with a clear, reliable information to inform decisions. So, why did IBO conduct this analysis? IBO has examined these issues before, most recently in 2022, and we have been getting requests to update our analysis. We also wanted to make our previous report broader and more comprehensive. So, this report breaks down emergency response times by advanced life support, ALS, generally the most serious calls, and basic life support, BLS, usually the less serious emergency calls. By borough, as well as left-side trends in emergency response time over a 10-year period. This report also looks at call volume and staffing levels over the same period, which have been rising, but at very different rates. And most importantly, this report aims to inform future program investments and changes. It's widely known EMS response times have been getting worse recently, but just knowing that is not sufficient to fix the problem. Policy researchers, we aim to understand trends across different geographies and to examine this very closely. The more knowledge we have about policy problems like this, the easier it will be to improve these issues. And ultimately, emergency response times can be, and often are, the difference between life and death in a medical. Let's take a step back and walk through what happens when someone calls 911. When someone calls 911, they are facing an help immediately. Every second matters. The series of blow charts on the screen will guide us through a iterative process when 911 is dialed in New York City. Calls are initially answered by a police department communications technician known as a PCT. 911, you have a police by medical emergency. How to call them. On the left, you can see that it's an emergency force from the police department. You can see that if an emergency requires a fire response, the PCT transfers the call to a special fire alarm call taker who works at the fire department, and then that dispatcher can send fire resources. On the right, you can see what happens in a medical emergency, and this is definitely the most complicated. In a medical emergency, the PCT attempts to transfer the call to an FDNY, emergency medical dispatcher, EMD, and if an EMD answers, they treat graduate numbers, and the PCT may not allow the EMD uses. Meanwhile, the address is transferred via a data link, as are calls where the caller guesses for whatever reason. Based on the answer to the various triage questions, the EMD records the content, such as cardiac, difficulty breathing, or trauma, automatic baby, and this is in decreasing order of severity. What calls, such as for cardiac arrest or choking, are processed and dispatched before higher numbered segment calls with less serious illnesses or injuries. After entering the call information for dispatch, the EMD may, in appropriate cases, remain on the line with the caller to provide pre-arrival instructions, which are incorporated into the triage algorithms, such as coaching the caller on how to begin compression only, cardiopulmonary resuscitation, CPR, One of the key takeaways in this report is that the level of complexity likely plays a role in why response times are bad and getting it. So how did we create this report and what data sets support data sets? Dispatch open data sets published by FDNY. The second is Mayor's Management of Open Data, CHOMS. Data sets published by FDNY system. This data set includes data for responses to all medical emergencies reported over the 911 system, carried out by both FDNY and non-FDNY influencers, and both are included within this report. Period of data responding within the 911 system. And our run when it begins when the call is made and ends when the incident is closed and the resolution is. Each record covered information about the incident as it relates to the assignment of resources, main data set that we used in this report. The second data set that we use in this report is personnel data, resource management system, CHARMS, which has personnel and staffing data that we use in this report for the purposes of emergency medical technician, EMT, and paramedic staffing level section of this report. This data set is based on internal city payroll data and is the only data set that we use that is not public. IBO is uniquely positioned to access city data under this New York City Charter, which enables IBO to request data from city agencies in order to ensure that IBO has access to the necessary data. IBO has recently focused on headcount and staffing data. While this data doesn't directly measure management performance, we often examine how different data sets relate to one another and what may be driving the trend that we observe. The data set that we used was the Mayor's Management Report, which is mandated by the New York City Charter, and the other performance. And MMR is released twice a year. The full fiscal year within the MMR. There are three primary methods used to calculate and report EMS response times that are important to understand. The first are FDNY dispatch plus travel time only by ambulances and fire companies, with calls starting at indication of a life-threatening emergency. The second being FDNY dispatch plus travel time only by ambulances and fire companies. And third, end-to-end response time, the time from the initial call to 911 to when the first unit arrives by ambulances and fire companies. The only indicator of the three that is designated as a critical indicator in the MMR is the second method, which is FDNY dispatch plus travel time only by ambulances and fire companies. This is despite the fact that end-to-end time is by far the most comprehensive measurement of response time, including the time from when the caller dials 911 until the first unit arrives on scene. In other words, this method accurately reflects a caller's experience of response times. IBO's report used multiple methods to show the importance of measuring response times comprehensively and in ways that are consistent with how the fire department typically does. On this screen, you will see two side-by-side bar charts. The bar chart on the left shows average end-to-end response times, which measures the time from the initial call to arrival, and the bar chart on the right shows FDNY's preferred method of reporting response times, which calculates the time from FDNY dispatch plus travel time until arrival. As shown in the left bar chart, there is a 2-minute and 32-second difference between these two response times calculations. The average end-to-end response time bar chart on the left includes police department and emergency medical dispatcher EMD processing time, while the preferred FDNY response bar chart on the right excludes this. So, how did IBO use open data for this analysis? I'll now go over the methodology used for this report. We began this analysis by reading in the open dataset in R by fiscal years 2014 to 2024. Since the open dataset contained data for many call types, but did not define which calls were designated as ALS or BLS, we broke down the data further by ALS and BLS calls based on a list of call types received from the fire department. We also created flags for ALS and BLS calls using the mutate and case one functions in R. To summarize the number of each call type, we used the group by and summarize functions, also in R. We also wanted to look at both response times, which are reported as averages, and how widely the call volume varies,
which are both well below and well above the average response time number. For this analysis, we analyze the calls using percentages under a given target or targets, a statistic long used nationally by organizations such as the National Fire Protection Association, NFPA. For this analysis of both ALS and BLS calls, we created flags for calls with response times less than 10 minutes and response times less than 20 minutes. We calculated call count and percentage of calls with response times less than 10 minutes and as well as less than 20 minutes by borough. We calculated the share by year for each borough. And lastly, we calculated the call count and percentage of calls with response times less than 10 minutes and response times less than 20 minutes citywide. If anyone has any specific technical questions about how we conducted this analysis, I would be happy to get into more detail afterwards. So now that I have gone over the why and the how, let's talk briefly about what we found in this report. Overall, the percentages of both ALS and BLS calls for which a response arrived in 10 minutes or less has declined in all boroughs over the past decade, although not equally. Unlike averages, when the percentage of responses under a target declines, that means response time is getting worse, not better. First, for the most serious ALS calls. Over the decade, the steepest decline in ALS calls with response times below 10 minutes was in Manhattan, with a 12 percentage point decline from 2014 to 2024, compared with a 6 percentage point decline in Staten Island. In 2024, the percent of ALS calls with response times less than 10 minutes was best in Staten Island at 82% and the worst in the Bronx at 75%. BLS calls have seen a similar trend, with response times below 10 minutes falling in all boroughs over the past decade, with even greater differences between the boroughs. The steepest decline in BLS calls with response times below 10 minutes was seen in Queens, with a 16 percentage point decline from 2014 to 2024, compared with a 10 percentage point decline in Staten Island. As with ALS calls, response times were the best in Staten Island and the worst in the Bronx. In 2024, the percent of BLS calls responded to in less than 10 minutes ranged from 68% in Staten Island to 48% in the Bronx. Overall, end-to-end response times to the most serious calls have increased to almost 11 minutes in 2024. This is almost 2 minutes longer than the lowest average time in over the decade, which was 8 minutes and 56 seconds in 2017. Over the same period of time, average response times, only counting dispatch and travel time, post-call processing, has also risen to 8 minutes and 16 seconds in 2024. Within the fire department, emergency medical technician, EMT, and paramedic staffing levels have increased proportionately less than the increase in the number of calls. This is the primary reason that the fire department has cited for an overall increase in response times. Now I will conclude with what IBO has learned from conducting this analysis. IBO is planning on continuing to examine and analyze response times to better understand why these trends are occurring. FDNY has cited staffing shortages and an increase in call volume as the primary reason contributing to worsening response times. More systemic analysis are needed in coordination with the fire department and elected officials to examine these issues further. The ultimate goal is to reduce response times everywhere, and this research, based on the open data set we used for this report, provides a starting place to figuring out how to best achieve this goal. Thank you very much for attending this presentation. We now have some time to answer questions. My contact information, as well as ads, is included on this slide. Please feel free to reach out with any questions following the presentation. Thank you. Great. First question. 90% of the calls were responded to in under 10 minutes. Yeah, of course. So advanced life support, ALS is defined as advanced life support, more often the more serious calls, and then BLS is defined as basic life support, often the less serious calls. The fire department has cited this is a reason for declining response time, or worsening response times, yes. But we're continuing to examine this issue. Based on research, did IBO determine any other factors that could have contributed to a decrease in response times, such as geographic barriers, such as more calls in areas that see more car traffic, or are further from the fire department dispatch locations, etc.?
That's a good question.
That's a great question. We're examining this for future research. Are there any other questions or anything we can clarify? Do you have any other avenues to research on this or any other hypotheses? Let's see. Great. I'm going to turn this over to Ed.
We're certainly going to continue to look into other avenues for researching the problems of response time, and we appreciate all of the suggestions and the input. We will also look at other data sources to see what we can do to integrate it, and we'll likely end up producing additional reports at some point.
Question. Will you publish a report on this? Do you want me to answer that one?
This presentation is based on a report that we recently published, and we will put the link in the chat for full report.
Question on ambulance. It's both FDNY and it's nonprofit and for-profit ambulances. It's both included in this report. Does the data break down by hospital or private or non-private by any chance? It does not, but that's a great question. So where the times increased, do you mind repeating? Yes. So the steepest decline in response times to ALS calls was in Manhattan, with a decline from 90% to 78% over the 2014 to 2024 period. And then for BLS calls, the percent of BLS calls responded to within 10 minutes has declined over every borough over the past decade, or the decade that we examined, 2014 to 2024. Was it increase in the time between call and dispatch, or between dispatch and arrival, or both? It was both. Thank you all so much for your time and questions.